Good morning. So we've heard a lot over the last day or so about the idea of collaboration. We've heard bobolinks touched on a fair amount, and I'm going to talk about sort of the intersection between bobolinks and collaboration, and hopefully a little bit about what we may be able to learn from that particular example. Some of the collaboration that's often involved under the Endangered Species Act is sort of formalized under the auspices of the ministry, such as the Bobolink Roundtable being one example. But some of the important elements of collaboration are much less formal or take place in much less formal settings. And I think it's useful to look at how that informal collaboration process has worked in this particular example, and what we might learn from that. So over the last several years, both CSIRO and COSEWIC, in a sense, have been pushing the envelope in terms of species that are designated. And in particular, of particular interest to us is that they've turned their attention to grassland birds. Grassland birds, as many of you know, have sustained major population declines. And just as one example, bobolinks over the past 40 years have sustained a decline between 70 and 80% of their population levels. So based on that rate of decline, bobolinks, eastern meadowlarks, barn swallows have all been designated as threatened in Ontario, and of course that brings them under the regulatory regime of the ESA. Yet all of those species, they're all agricultural species in a sense, and they're still relatively common in hayfields and pastures in many parts of the province, and particularly in the cow-calf areas. And the cow-calf areas, for those of you who may not be involved in agriculture, essentially is a belt across southern Grey and Bruce counties, across along the southern edge of the Shield into eastern Ontario. So we can argue the wisdom of pushing the envelope in terms of species designation, as John Riley did yesterday, or we can alternatively praise the foresight of the scientists involved in terms of addressing those species before they reach the critical stage. But in any case, we're at the point where those designations have been made, and we have to deal with that. So where I work in Carden, I'm accustomed to working with species like loggerhead shrike, where we have a few dozen landowners that are affected by loggerhead shrike nesting habitat. And across the province, because the populations are so low, I mean, we probably in total have less than 100 landowners certainly that would be affected. When we're dealing with species like bobolinks or meadowlarks, we're dealing with some estimated 25 to 30,000 farmers that are affected directly in terms of having meadowlark or bobolink habitat on their lands. And so we're dealing with a whole different set of challenges in terms of the scale of the people involved. So when that designation was announced from CSIRO, in terms of, in particular, the first one, in terms of bobolink being identified as a threatened species in Ontario by CSIRO, I think that decision caught many of us somewhat by surprise. And my sense, I guess, is that there was sort of a collective reaction, certainly within the farm community, I think within the environmental community, and I suspect within the ministry itself, of sort of, well, a polite way of putting it is, oh God. I think it was probably a little more colorful than that in terms of the reaction about what's that going to mean going forward, and how is this all going to play out. Within the farm sector, and certainly there are others in the room here who could speak better to this than I can, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, Peter. But within the farm community, I think there's a general concern about the increase in regulation around things like nutrient management, around the Greenbelt regulations, a general anxiety about increasing regulation of that sector, and a general anxiety about sort of loss of independence of operations. I think also within the farm community, in a general sense, they haven't had to deal a lot of farmers, I should say, haven't had to deal with the Endangered Species Act and its implications. So it's something that's new to them, it's unknown to them. What they have heard about it probably is, a sort of reputation that's going to freeze your land and your land uses and interfere with how you make management decisions. All of those things unwelcome. In terms of bobolinks and meadowlarks in particular, because we're dealing with the cow-calf sector, we're dealing with a sector of agriculture which has traditionally had low profit margins. It's dealt with things like the BSE crisis, which really hammered the beef sector some years ago now. We're dealing often with older, aged farmers or part-time farmers on lower quality lands, on lands which haven't been converted to other kinds of crops. And we're dealing with a sector that is often buffeted by decisions that are made elsewhere in Washington or in forums for trade policy, and that has suffered as a result of many of those kinds of decisions. One of the concerns, certainly, I think, within the environmental community anyway, was that this could play into the hands of some of the landowner rights groups that have been most active in Eastern Ontario, but in other sections of Ontario as well. And certainly in our area, we have lots of signs that say, government back off, this is our land, and so on, that kind of landowner right perspective, which is, to which many farmers are sympathetic, some farmers at least are sympathetic. And there are also concerns about how this plays into the agenda of people like Tim Hudak, and some of his pronouncements about what bobolinks are doing to farmers and what plans he might have for the future of the Endangered Species Act if the government changes. So in terms of an initial response, one of the things that happened which was very interesting, and I had the privilege of being involved in this on behalf of the Couchiching Conservancy, was that there were a series of meetings held, a series of basically unprecedented meetings between farm organizations, particularly the Ontario Cattlemen's Association, the Dairy Farmers of Ontario, the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, and others who sort of came in and out and who ultimately signed on, and conservation groups led by Ontario Nature, Bird Studies Canada, and several others, and there were others who signed on as well. Basically sit down and talk about how do we address this emerging situation, and how do we try and find something positive out of a situation which there was a lot of concern could sort of spin out of control and result in a considerable backlash. Those initial meetings took place outside of any kind of government control or involvement, other than some quiet encouragement, but certainly no direct role. And I think it's fair to say that it was that those meetings were based on a mutual recognition that kind of we all had a problem. And I give a lot of credit to the agricultural organizations that took part. It took considerable courage, I would suggest, on their part. They were constructive, consistently constructive. They were willing to talk. They were willing to listen. I give a lot of credit to Ontario Nature and the other organizations from the environmental side as well, who were willing to talk and willing to be flexible. So out of that series of meetings, essentially what emerged was a series of joint recommendations to the Minister of Natural Resources in this case. And I emphasize joint. These were signed on to by the organizations involved. It was, a couple of pages basically of summary document. And in summary, what it suggested was, first of all, we needed some breathing room, so we all agreed to the idea of a 3-year exemption for normal farm practices, which basically meant in bald terms, if you were a farmer, you could continue to cut your hay. The concern was, of course, that depending how you interpret the restrictions associated with the Endangered Species Act, by cutting hay prior to about the middle of July, you destroy the nests and the habitat for bobolinks and meadowlark in particular, and as a result of that, you could be in contravention of the Act. And that was creating a huge amount of concern about the implications of that. The 3-year time frame was essentially to provide enough time to develop a recovery strategy, to more fully examine the science and the issues and potential solutions, and for the government to respond to that through their government response statement. So an opportunity to take a good close look and explore how we might deal with this particular situation. And because there was a feeling that what we had started in terms of a collaborative approach was useful and working, to create some kind of a mechanism to continue. And we suggested to the minister that there be some kind of ongoing mechanism, and the minister essentially responded by creating the Bobolink Roundtable, which includes other parties as well, and I'm not going to talk about that specifically because others are going to do that. And then finally, we jointly identified the need to address some of the key information gaps and to create and test incentive programs that were going to be meaningful and effective within the farm community. So as I said, the minister accepted those joint recommendations. Why wouldn't he? If you've got both sides of that issue coming together and saying this is how we think we should proceed, set up the roundtable. Betty Jean Cruz, who you've seen over the last day or two, is one of the co-chairs of the roundtable. John McCracken from Bird Studies Canada is the other co-chair. You're going to hear more from Betty Jean about details of the roundtable and some of the activities that have gone on there. And both M&R staff and OMAFRA staff provide support and information resources to the roundtable. And that's been extremely helpful. And it's been extremely helpful that we're hearing not just the M&R endangered species perspective. We're also hearing what's going on in the agricultural sector and background information on that from OMAFRA, which has also been very useful. So, clearly the roundtable is struggling with some difficult issues. One of the biggest challenges for the roundtable is how to create some kind of effective incentive programs on this kind of scale, involving this number of landowners, when government funds are so limited, and clearly that's a situation that's not going to change in the short term. So one of the things that the roundtable has been exploring is this concept of SARBEX, and Tosh is going to talk in more detail about that. But essentially the idea of using the offset requirements associated with overall benefit permits for developers to create and restore habitats elsewhere as a mechanism for funding some of the incentive programs, which could be a benefit to farmers and other organizations. So at the same time as the roundtable has been doing its work, the recovery strategy process has been grinding along. After an initial strategy was under discussion for bobolinks, and then eastern meadowlark was designated as well. It became a joint strategy for both bobolinks and meadowlarks. The strategy development was led by a group led by Bird Studies Canada. I was part of that group, along with about half a dozen others. And that recovery strategy has now been posted on the EBR and comments received. As we went through the process as well, we had 3 workshops with various participants from various sectors, which were extremely helpful. We had tons of comments, some 500 plus comments back on various submissions. But I'll just touch on two main points, I guess. One is that, it was our conclusion that while there are some other issues around bobolinks and meadowlarks, like losses on their wintering grounds and during migration and so on, the overwhelming factor in terms of their population levels is habitat availability for breeding here in Ontario. And secondly, that as a goal, as a recovery goal, what we talked about was over the next decade, reducing the level of annual population decline from what is currently about 4% a year to less than 1% a year. So what we thought was a challenging but achievable kind of goal. And the philosophy of that recovery strategy, and these are recommendations to government, remember, they're not finalized by any means, they're recommendations, but essentially long on carrots, short on sticks. Our sense was that a heavy-handed regulatory approach just isn't going to work in this setting. It has a lot of potential for backfiring, and we've seen some of that already. We've seen certainly the development industry, where many developers now who rent out land, own land that they rent out to farmers, include what they call the bobolink clause. The bobolink clause essentially says you can't grow forage, i.e. hay, or you can't pasture the land because it could become bobolink habitat. So instead they grow corn. Not a good outcome from our point of view. But we're looking for a program that's largely based on incentive programs, education, best management practices, voluntary actions, and so on. So a different approach than in many cases. Now, in terms of the reaction of the farm community, I'm characterizing this essentially as generally cautious but quiet. There's still lots of mistrust. There's mistrust about what government might do. There's mistrust about what happens after the temporary exemption expires, and and is that going to be continued and in what form? But there's also, I think, a sense of waiting for this process to play out, waiting for the results of the government response statement to the recovery strategy and the roundtable process to play out, looking for certainty for what's going to happen in the longer term. And in my opinion, I think in this situation, that's probably the best we could hope for. Cautious but quiet. I'm not sure we could do any better than that. So just to wrap up in terms of where I see this thing going, I'll give you the bad news first and then the good news. The bad news, grassland habitats in general, certainly habitats for bobolinks, are greatly influenced by those macroeconomic factors, things like demand for beef and prices on the world market, things like U.S. subsidies for ethanol corn, which is driving up prices for corn and soybeans, and we are seeing land conversion in our area from pasture and hay to row crops on a scale that I haven't seen for the last couple of decades. So, there are some real strong challenges there, and that's not a factor that's decreasing, it's a factor that's increasing. On the other hand, we're seeing in many areas that have previously been pastured that are being abandoned because of relatively low prices for beef, and they're returning to forest. There are some opportunities there in terms of stewardship. There's also some challenges. I've already mentioned we're seeing government resources and government capacity dwindling, and the kind of restructuring and refocusing initiatives that we're seeing are really oriented towards a spiral downwards. Less money, fewer people, and no sign of improvement on the horizon there. So out of all that, it's going to be a real challenge not to see further significant population declines. On the other hand, the good news, I think, is that really for the first time in a meaningful way, I think the farm groups and other sectors, the environmental sector in particular, have been talking. There's been a lot of positive discussion and movement there and mutual understanding. We are seeing some of these new mechanisms such as SARBEX emerging and new relationships emerging. And I think that's going to be really important for the future, beyond the three species that we're talking about right now. And we still have some time. We're talking about populations that are are still in the order of hundreds of thousands of birds that are there now. So we have some time, and we're not talking about an immediate crisis point. So I'm cautiously optimistic myself, I guess, that we can create a future that still includes bobolinks and other grassland birds as an important component of the Ontario landscape. And more importantly, I think that the experience over the last couple of years with bobolinks demonstrates that the potential of collaborative approaches, start early, engage the key stakeholders, work on solutions rather than just stating hard positions. It can work, and it's vastly more effective than the stale old tactics of confrontation and conflict. Thank you.